Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 17th, 2023. This is the week in which the Davos World Economic Forum will be convening in Switzerland. Also, the Ukraine Contact Group will be meeting at Ramstein Air Base. And there's a great deal of anxiety in the transatlantic world. And I'm going to go through a background of what it is they're worried about and why they should be worried, because there's a global rebellion against their form of globalization. Now, on the one side, we have the escalating buildup of global NATO, which is designed to confront and contain Russia and China, despite a worsening economic situation in the transatlantic nations that are committed to this. Now, essentially, this is the US-UK transatlantic order enforced by NATO and backed by the European Union. But what we're seeing is a cratering of the whole policy, because they're now forced in a war which they cannot win in Ukraine. The Brits are in the lead on this, and you can see this. They're pledging tanks and artillery. There are two British defense officials who are going to be on a tour this week, going to Canada, the US, and Germany, prior to the Ramstein meeting at the airbase to provoke more support for the war. And the British are providing tanks and big artillery guns. And what they're coordinating is sanctions and more weapons deliveries. And they're going to put more pressure on the US and Germany to do that. So this is the direction of the Anglo-American world at a point at which the question remains, can they afford to do this? The German Defense Minister Lambrecht was announced that she'll be resigning as of yesterday. Japan has made decisions to raise their defense spending by 26%, which will bring it up to $50 billion this year. Now, their annual debt service is $175 billion a year out of a budget of $839 billion. So now 20% of their budget is going into debt service as they're planning this 26% increase in defense spending. U.S. total debt service is 15% of the budget compared to 20% for Japan, and the U.S. is approaching its debt ceiling. So you can see the problems that exist in the transatlantic world. Add to that inflation, deindustrialization, energy shortages, supply chain breaks, and so on. And with such a deep economic crisis in the transatlantic sector, why is no one asking, can we afford to be in a war with Russia and China? Now, this is the backdrop to this year's World Economic Forum gathering in Davos, where the billionaires of finance and the military-industrial complex and the corporate cartels will be meeting under the title, quote, "Cooperation in a Fragmented World," unquote. Now, they're meeting under less than ideal circumstances, facing a rebellion against their rules-based order. And this is typified by a report which shows the anxiety among these so-called elites that was filed in the Washington Post today, titled The Worry in Davos, Globalization is Under Siege. Let me just give you some quotes from this article because it'll give you a sense of what's on the minds of these characters as they're gathering. They're not the self-confident elites that they were, according to the Washington Post, back in 2013, when the WEF spoke about resilient dynamism and post-crisis optimism coming off the crisis of 2008, 2009. And at that point, they were optimistic about the future of the neoliberal order. Today, they're talking about one of Perma Crisis. Now, here's how the Washington Post describes it. The meeting this year occurs in a never-ending cascade of calamity: war, climate catastrophe, energy price chaos, inflation, epidemics of hunger and disease, political instability, and widening economic inequity. Now, what's the cause of these things? It's self-inflicted. It's the failure of the neoliberal order. It doesn't work. As Lyndon LaRouche pointed out in 1971, for this liberal order to survive, it has to engage in self-cannibalization, starting with the developing sector, but increasingly cannibalizing the advanced sector through deindustrialization, wage cuts, accelerated death rates, and a reduction of world population, which is now underway, at least in the advanced sector, so-called advanced sector. The title, well, and the Washington Post article then cites the Economist magazine. And of course, you know, the Economist is the original publication of the Rothschilds. It's the City of London flagship magazine. And what they're writing about is a new logic that threatens globalization. According to The Economist, the danger is of a spiral into protectionism worldwide that may imperil, quote, the causes of liberal democracy and market capitalism, unquote. What they don't realize is that so-called liberal democracy and market capitalism depends on looting, depends on what LaRouche identified as a Shaktian economic model, which depends on cheap labor, cheap raw materials, and an expendable workforce. Now, at this conference, the Washington Post goes on to say that one of the speakers will be Neil Ferguson, who will be speaking about reglobalization. And they say this means reconfiguring supply chains away from conflict spots and adversarial states. In other words, decoupling with Russia and China. And that's the policy of the West. Is that going to work? Well, we already see that the effect of the energy crisis and the economic crisis is deindustrializing Europe. The German firms are looking to go somewhere where they can get cheap energy. They had at one point cheap Russian oil and gas. What was wrong with that? Well, the decision was made that Russia is becoming too powerful and has to be defeated before it threatens this new world order. And that's what's the backdrop to this. It's not really anything that Russia and China are doing, except they're not committed to the idea of a unipolar order. And the Davos group will be meeting, if necessary, to discuss how to make the unipolar order survive at gunpoint. Now, the ultimate problem was identified by a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman named Wang Wenbin. And listen to his words. This is very, very interesting. The U.S. preaches the so-called rules-based order, but is second to none when it comes to undermining international rules and order. After reviewing U.S. policies of sanctions, wars, coercive diplomacy, Wang Wenbin concludes, quote, facts prove time and time again that the U.S. does not care about rules or order. It cares about only one thing. And when he's talking about the U.S., he's talking about the U.S. establishment, the military-industrial complex more broadly, the corporate cartels. What he says is they care about one thing only, the perpetuation of U.S. hegemony. Any existing rule that stands in the way of U.S. interests will be ignored, replaced, or even thrown out the window, even if it was proposed and written by the U.S. itself. That's the fraud of the rules-based order. It's not based on international law. It's not based on natural law or principles. It's based on what is immediately necessary to protect the bloated balance sheets of the collapsing financial system of the West. And if countries refuse to knuckle under to the demands that they provide cheap labor and cheap raw materials, they're met with sanctions, wars, and coups. And that time has run out. This empire, this geopolitical empire, is reaching its end. There's nothing predestined about the triumph of this, that the neoliberals and their warhawks will be able to establish a re-globalization no matter what Neil Ferguson and his backers say. And we'll have some more reports on this as it develops during the course of the week. Thanks for joining me today. Be sure to go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com website to get more updates. And while you're there, sign up for my blog page and also look into the prospects for you to get a subscription to the Executive Intelligence Review Daily Alert. Thanks for joining me. See you tomorrow.